The gravel under my tires used to sound like freedom, just a steady, rhythmic crunch that meant I was finally home and the rest of the world could go hang. But that was before the neighborhood association next door decided my 40 acres of heaven was an eyesore on their taxpayer-funded paradise. I've lived on this ridge outside a little town called Blackwood for 20 years, long before those cookie-cutter mansions with their identical beige siding and manicured lawns started creeping up the hillside like a slow-moving rash. And for a long time, we had live and let live kind of deal. But power is a funny thing, especially when you give it to people who have nothing better to do than measure the height of their neighbor in Oppo's grass with a ruler. It wasn't long before the Blackwood Heights HOA decided their jurisdiction didn't in Oppo's stop at their Stonegate entrance. They started small, sending me polite little letters about my non-conforming perimeter fence, which is just a standard cattle wire fence that's been there since the 80s. But then the letters got nastier, claiming my old equipment barn was a visual nuisance that was tanking their property values. I ignored them because, frankly, my deed is older than their entire subdivision, and I'm not part of their little club. But things took a dark turn when my son, Elias, came back from his third tour overseas. Elias is the kind of man who carries a lot of silence in his pockets. A guy who's seen the worst corners of the world and just wanted a porch, a cold beer, and the sound of the wind through the pines to settle his nerves. He's barely 30, but his eyes look like they've lived a century, and he wasn't in Oppo's interested in playing games with suburban bureaucrats, which is exactly why they targeted him. The HOA board, led by a woman named Eleanor Vance, who looked like she was born with a permanent scowl and a clipboard, decided to pass an emergency amendment making their community a 55-plus restricted zone. And even though my ranch is separate, they started treating Elias like a vagrant on his own land. That's when they brought in Mitch. Mitch was one of those guys who clearly washed out of the police academy but never let go of the dream. A man who spent way too much money on tactical gear and not enough on actual training. He drove a blacked-out SUV with amber lights and had HOA safety and damp, compliance plastered across the doors in a font that looked suspiciously like the state trooper logo, and he started patrolling the county road like he was patrolling the green zone. He'd park at my gate, staring through binoculars, or he'd accidentally wander onto my property to leave citations on Elias's truck for, unauthorized parking, which is a fancy way of saying he didn't in Oppo's. Like seeing a dusty Ford F-150 in a neighborhood where everyone drives German SUVs. I remember walking into Eleanor's office at the clubhouse, tossing a stack of those fake tickets on her mahogany desk, and telling her as calmly as I could that if her mall cop stepped foot on my gravel one more time, I'd be calling the real sheriff. She didn't in Oppo's even look up from her laptop, just gave me this thin, icy smile and said that security is a holistic endeavor and that my son's erratic presence was causing anxiety among the silver-haired residents who paid a lot of money for peace of mind. I told her the only thing causing anxiety was a middle-aged man in a fake Kevlar vest playing soldier on my property, but she just leaned back, adjusted her pearls, and told me that, perception is reality in a community like this, and right then, I realized she wasn't Oppo's just a busybody. She was a predator who thought she could bully me off my land so they could expand their development. The tension built for weeks, like the air before a dry lightning storm, with Mitch getting bolder and more aggressive every day, tailing Elias whenever he went into town for supplies and shouting about, rules and regulations, from the road. Elias just took it with that quiet, terrifying patience he learned in the special forces, telling me, Dad, Don and Oppo's, worry about it. He's just a barking dog behind a fence, But even the most patient man has a limit, and Mitch was about to find out where that limit was. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those scorching afternoons where the heat waves make the horizon look like it's melting, and I was out by the barn trying to fix a hydraulic leak on the tractor. Elias had just pulled in with a load of feed, the dust still settling around his truck, when I heard that familiar, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. Way too fast, way too close. Mitch's SUV slid to a halt right in the middle of my driveway, blocking Elias in, and before the engine was even off, Mitch was out of the door, screaming at the top of his lungs about, in quote, trespassing, in quote, and in quote, failure to comply with community safety protocols, end quote. He was wearing a full tactical rig, a badge that looked like it came from a cereal box, and a look of pure, unhinged rage in his eyes. Elias hopped out of the truck, hands out to his sides, trying to de-escalate, saying, in quote, "Man, you're on private property, just turn around and go home," end quote. But Mitch wasn't oppos, hearing it. He reached for his hip and pulled out a Glock, leveling it right at my son's chest, his hands shaking so hard I could see the barrel vibrating from 20 feet away. End quote, on the ground. Get on the ground now. I'm detaining you for investigation. End quote. Mitch screamed, his voice cracking like a teenager in oppos. My heart didn't in oppos. Just stopped. It felt like it imploded. Seeing a gun pointed at your child on the land where you raised him is a kind of horror I can't in oppos even put into words. And I started moving toward them, shouting for Mitch to put the damn thing away before he did something he couldn't in oppos. Take back. Elias, though. Elias didn't in oppos. Move an inch. He didn't in oppos. Flinch, didn't in oppos. Blink, didn't in oppos. Even look scared. He just went into this zone, this cold, analytical stillness that made the air around him feel heavy. He looked Mitch dead in the eye and said, in a voice so quiet it was more dangerous than a roar, end quote, "You've got your finger on the trigger, Mitch. You're shaking, your safety is off, and you're standing in a low-traction stance. You really don and oppos. Do you want to do this?" End quote. Mitch sneered, trying to regain his, end quote, alpha, end quote, status, yelling that he was the law in this community and that Elias was nothing but a, end quote, punk threat, end quote. But you could see the moment he realized he was out of his depth. He had the gun, sure, but Elias had the soul of a predator who had survived things Mitch couldn't and oppos even dream of in his worst nightmares. In a blur of motion that I still can and oppos quite replay in my head. It was like a frame was missing from a movie. Elias stepped inside the line of fire. His hand lashed out like a snake, and before Mitch could even register a thought, the gun was gone. Elias had twisted it out of his hand, cleared the chamber, and dropped the magazine into the dirt before Mitch could even finish his next breath. The silence that followed was deafening. Mitch stood there, his empty hand still shaped like he was holding a pistol, his mouth hanging open, looking like a little boy who had just been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Elias didn't end oppos. Hit him. He didn't end oppos. Even raise his voice. He just handed the empty gun back to me and looked at Mitch with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. End quote. I've had real soldiers point real weapons at me in places you can't in oppos. Find on a map, end quote. Elias said, end quote. And you're just a sad man in a costume. Get off our land before the real police get here, because I'm not as patient as my father is, end quote. Mitch didn't in oppos say a word. He just scrambled back in his SUV, nearly hitting my gate post as he floored it back toward the safety of his manicured lawns and beige houses. I didn't in oppos wait. I called the sheriff's department, but I didn't in oppos just report a trespasser. I reported an armed assault and an impersonation of a peace officer, and I told them I had the whole thing on the high-definition security cameras I'd installed the week before. When the deputies arrived, they weren't in oppos the, end quote, friends of the HOA, end quote, that Eleanor probably expected. They were old-school Texas lawmen who didn't in oppos take kindly to some, end quote, security consultant, end quote, brandishing a firearm on a private ranch, and when they saw the footage of Mitch pointing a loaded gun at a decorated veteran, the mood turned very dark, very fast. But the real, end quote, price, end quote, they paid wasn't oppos just Mitch going away in handcuffs, though seeing him being led out of his, end quote, patrol vehicle, end quote, in zip ties was a beautiful sight. It was what happened next. We didn't in oppos just stop at the criminal charges. I hired the meanest, most expensive land use attorney in the state, a guy who lived to eat HOAs for breakfast, and we went for the jugular. We filed a massive civil suit for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and civil rights violations, but the end quote, smoking gun, end quote, came during discovery when we got access to the HOA's internal emails. It turns out Eleanor and the board had been promising Mitch a, end quote, bonus, end quote. If he couldn't, quote, encourage, end quote, me to sell my land by making life unbearable, and they'd even been using HOA fees to pay his, end quote, legal defense fund, end quote, in advance because they knew what he was doing was illegal. The fallout was catastrophic for them. Once the residents of Blackwood Heights found out their monthly dues were being used to fund a private militia and a series of felony crimes, the board was ousted in a literal midnight coup. The association was sued into oblivion by its own members. The insurance company refused to cover the settlement because of the criminal intent, and Eleanor Vance ended up losing her house to pay for the legal fees. The HOA was eventually dissolved by a court order and placed under a neutral receiver, effectively stripping away all the, end quote, power, end quote, they'd spent years weaponizing against their neighbors. These days, the Ridge is quiet again. The blacked-out SUVs are gone. The, end quote, emergency, end quote, 55-plus rules were scrapped, and Mitch is serving a 3-year sentence for aggravated assault and impersonating an officer. Elias still sits on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over the pines, and every now and then, one of the neighbors from the development will drive by and actually wave. Not because they have to, but because they're finally free from the little empire that tried to turn us all against each other. It's a strange world where you have to go to war to find peace on your own land. But I guess some people only understand the value of a boundary when they're forced to stay behind it. I often wonder, though, what if Elias hadn't and Oppos? He been who he was? What if it had been a regular kid or an elderly neighbor who didn't and Oppos? He know how to handle a man with a gun and a god complex. It makes me realize that these little neighborhood boards, these, end quote, communities, end quote, built on rules and exclusion, are only as good as the people running them. And when you give a small person a little bit of power, they'll almost always try to use it to make themselves feel big. So, I'm curious, have any of you ever dealt with an HOA that thought they were the Supreme Court, or a, end quote, security guard, end quote, who forgot where their authority ended? Did you fight back, or did you just move out? Drop a comment below and let me know, because I think it's time we start talking about where, end quote, community safety, end quote, ends in, end quote, organized harassment, end quote, begins.